question about the Shoreline area.
Mhm.
I was asked by the Parks Department to help come up with a Lashutsi name for a new park down north of Richmond Beach. And a friend of mine that speaks fluent Lashutsi gave me the name, the Caillou Ach, which means connect. And the city named the park Caillou Ach and planted connect throughout the park.
Wonderful.
How else, what other ways did the Shoreline area get used by the natives?
That's a very interesting topic, and I've written extensively about that for the Shoreline Historical Museum. There were no native villages in the Shoreline area. The closest one would have been down in Salmon Bay. But there were villages around it, and it was an area used because it was rich in many resources. Connecting, like you said, which was used as a narcotic, as an additive to tobacco when they would smoke. But there were lots of other resources that were used. The people walked trails into the Shoreline area and camped in the Shoreline area to access these resources. So what they would do was they would go up, and there are 4 places in Shoreline that are named. They actually have named campsites that are named, were named by the native people. And whenever a campsite is named, it was named because people were familiar with it, and that's where they would go. And not just a family, but lots of families who were all intermarried anyway. And so they would go to these places, and they'd probably spend a week, if not more, at these campsites. So for example, there are sites on the beach, at the one you mentioned, and at near Piper Creek, but also at Boeing Creek and a couple of other sites in Shoreline. And they would take in February, when the people left the longhouses to go start the year-long collection to sustain their lives, but also to provide surpluses to see them through the winter. Surpluses also just to invite people to mass celebrations. Any idiot could live in this world because it had so many resources. But the native people's intent was to flourish in the world. And so they had these wonderful celebrations, which were essentially ways in which hosts could give away wealth, property, but also food, and feed the people. And the idea of feeding someone was a very important thing. Hospitality was everything. So they needed supplies for that, and so they would go to these camps. And the problem of logistics was a very significant one for the people. So if you're going to spend weeks at a camp, what do you need? What do you take with you? You want comfort. Again, these weren't blue tarp campers. These were people who intended to be comfortable wherever they were. And I always like to think of things through the eyes of a child. What would it have been like, first of all, to leave your longhouse, this cramped but warm and friendly longhouse, and to go out on an adventure? First, you would put all your supplies in a canoe. You would actually take several canoes and put the house planks on them. So you had a deck, it was a catamaran, and you'd load all the gear on that, and then you'd go north or wherever to your campsite. And then you would erect the campsite, which meant shelters. Remember, this is the springtime, and from around March, and it's always raining, so you want comfort. So you build these shelters, and you have bedding and everything, but also you're there for a purpose, and it's a lot of hard work. And so if you're going to be collecting things to preserve, you need to dry them. You need to either dry them in the sun, if there is any, over fires, more likely. But you have to pick them, you have to process them, you have to do all this stuff, and you need all the gear necessary to do this. And so the camps are staging grounds for this. And then, so these were beach camps, most of them. And then you would go inland on a trail to places like Bitter Lake, Oak Lake, Holler Lake, and the Denny Swamp, which was a cranberry bog, Ronald Bog, which was a cranberry bog. And so once you got there, you had to have a secondary camp. A lot of these places were named, which meant that more than one day would be spent there overnight. So you needed an overnight camp. Again, a comfortable overnight camp. Men and women and children were part of this. The camp had to be supplied with food, and so the men went out hunting. They would collect clams and marine life at the beach. They would bring it over the trail to the camp. The women would make stews. Well, what do you make stew in? You make it in baskets, and you put hot rocks in the baskets. And so you have to have all this gear, and you had elkhorn spoons to dip the soup and put it into the tip of your mouth. You needed ovens to roast things in. You needed all this stuff, and it took an enormous amount of effort to transport it and also to prepare it. So, like I say, logistically, these were major events. And so the effort expended upon them dominated 9 months of the year. And a lot of it was carried out in Shoreline. So these camps were very important. And it's no accident that there were middens, shell middens, at many of these freshwater lakes. Bitter Lake, Oak Lake, Holler Lake, Lake Ballinger, probably Echo Lake. In any case, there was a constant traffic up and down these trails to supply the camps, but also once you collected, let's say, berries, cranberries, let's say, you would dry them to reduce the weight because, and sometimes the women would carry, well, most of the time, the women, when they would dry the berries, they would carry backpacks, they were with tumplines over their foreheads, big woven baskets filled with dried berries, 50 pounds worth. They'd carry these over the trails back to the canoes, to take them down to store them in the winter village so that they would be there when they came for the winter. Back and forth, a lot of work. Everybody was put to work. One particular episode just I find delightful, and that was when girls matured, which is to say when they were having their periods. When they were sequestered. They were not allowed to be out in public because it was believed their influence negatively influenced hunting, fishing, even war. But so they couldn't be around people, but they still had to work. So if they were picking berries, their mothers would put soft pine wood sticks in their mouth, and they would, okay, bite down. And then so that you keep that in your mouth while you're picking berries. And then periodically we're going to come and check. And if the stick was stained with berry juice, you knew that the girl had defied her taboo and was eating the berries she was picking, but you couldn't have that. So it was to keep control of these errant children. But the point was everybody worked. But then when they were through working, they did what everybody loved to do. They talked incessantly. And talking was a way of sharing who's doing what to whom, what's happening, who was born, who passed away, all this stuff. And there were pioneers. The pioneer lifestyle could often be very good. Well, first of all, a lot of them were independent men. They didn't have families, and so they were lonely most of the time. And so they looked wistfully at these native families camping who were talking. And it was said, for example, clam diggers. When the tide was out, you had about 4 hours, and you had to work like the devil to get all these clams dug and cleaned and all that, put in baskets. But then, when the tide came in, it was your time. You socialized, the kids played. Usually the women gathered around, and they were just incessantly involved in conversation because that's how you caught up with people. And that's how you discuss things. And the men the same way. And the pioneers said that was one of the most charming aspects of native life. And we often think of native people as, dour and silent and all that. Well, they were that way in formal situations and when they were talking with strangers. But together, from what I read and what I hear and what I experienced myself, is they were wonderful conversationalists. And life was very rich for them. There was a need for conversation. Not just for knowledge, but entertainment as well. And so that took place in the camps as well. But imagine, first of all, you're in this magnificent setting. And its magnificence is because your people, for thousands of years, have been working to keep the trees spaced. How do you do that? Well, you set fires every 3 or 4 years to burn the dead wood so you don't have catastrophic fires, to keep trees spaced so that enough sunlight comes in, so that the plants that the deer and the elk need to feed on grow. They don't live on grass, they live on salal, they live on huckleberries. You need all these things, and also, there are the berries. We require the berries as good vitamin C. Even if they didn't call it vitamin C, they knew that this was a crucial part of their diet. And so, this surroundings with these lordly forests, with these rich beaches, with streams teeming with fish because of sensible management, that was the setting in which they lived. And I think, again, in the eyes of children, it had to have been an indescribable pleasure. It was also a lot of work, but everybody worked. And the wonderful thing about native life, and that struck me, and a lot of settlers said this, was native people never struck their children. They never beat them. Sometimes if a child was just getting too much, a father might take them by the hair, put them underneath the water for bring them up. But usually I was at the beach. But no, they never struck their children, and there was never any crisis when people were teenagers, because they were fully a part of the community. When the stories were told, when the myths were recited, the children were there. When the ghosts were welcomed back, or when the ghosts were present in the community in the winter solstice, and there were ceremonies held in their honor to get souls that they had kidnapped back to their owners, the children were there. And so I look at the evidence, and I see the shoreline area. As I say, it was not a place one lived in permanently, but it was a place used heavily during the course of the year. And those periods of use must have been spectacular and wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.